Okay, so the question of this talk is the question whether meat is required for consciousness. And the upshot of this is that a non-meat, can you see my arrow?
Yeah. You see your arrow very clear.
So this is intended to symbolize a non-meat machine. So the question of whether meat is required for consciousness is relevant to the question of whether a non-meat machine could be conscious. So I have six uh, uh, items in my, so first of all, what is meat? And I'm not really going to answer that in any direct way. Meat-friendly theories of consciousness, electrochemical processing. I'll say something about evolution, and then something about Godfrey Smith. And if I have time, I'll talk about this. Okay, some of you may have seen this article that came out recently about the prospects of machine consciousness. And one assumption that they make and state very clearly, they say, our method for investigating whether current or near future AI systems might be conscious is based on three assumptions. These are, and the first of them is computational functionalism. Implementing computations of a certain kind is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. So it is possible in principle for non-organic artificial systems to be conscious. So this is the question of this talk. Is it true that there is no biological necessary condition on consciousness? In other words, given my use of the word meat, is it true that that meat is not required? So meat is a kind of code word for something about our biology. Now, the most obvious objection is that neuroscience and biology more generally are computational. So what is the issue? Well, it's a often mentioned point that a computational implementation of a rainstorm need not be wet. The computational implementation need not replicate the wetness properties of the rainstorm. And similarly, a computational implementation of a neural process need not replicate the conscious properties of that process. So what is this distinction between simulation and implementation? Simulation duplicates the input-output of a process, whereas implementation of a process duplicates not just the input-output, but also the intervening processing at some level of description. And then the point here is that simulation of a rainstorm need not be wet, but an implementation at the right level, whatever that may be, would be wet. Now, it's often said that large language models like ChatGPT simulate mentality rather than actually having mentality. But you might ask, what about an AI that works in a different way, not by simulation? Could meat be required? Well, to think about this question, we can consider a very simple computation and ask about its implementation. So let's think about the simplest computational device that I'll tell you, the simplest one I can think of is a gate. And one very simple gate is an AND gate. So let's ask about that, the implementation of an AND gate. So what is an AND gate? Well, it obeys the truth table for AND. When both inputs are 1, it outputs a 1, otherwise outputs a 0. And every philosopher is familiar with this from the truth table, the propositional logic truth table. Now, we can ask the question, are two AND gates that are computationally equivalent in the sense of embodying this truth table, must they be the same in sub-computational properties? And the answer is clearly no. Pardon me. So these, we have two, sorry, I went on the wrong. We have two AND gates here that are different in sub-computational properties. So this is a power source, two switches, and a lamp. If both switches are on, the lamp is on, otherwise it's off. That is an AND gate. But here's a mechanical AND gate. If you push one of these things, it doesn't make this move. If you push the other one, it doesn't make it move either. But if you push both of them, it does make it move. So that is a mechanical AND gate. And this illustrates that sub-computational properties of the simplest computational device may be quite different. And that raises the question of whether a large language model like the one pictured here might be an implementation of our computational structure that doesn't allow for consciousness. So the thought here is meat implementations might be required for consciousness, but how can we ever approach this issue? Well, first of all, what is a meat implementation? Well, it's something biological, but I'm not going to try to give a definition. I'm going to approach the issue indirectly. So what I will talk about is meat-friendly and unfriendly theories of consciousness. So the four main theories of consciousness are the biological, global workspace, higher order, and integrated information theory. These are the ones that are most discussed in the literature, and also the ones that the Templeton World Charities adversarial collaborations are based on. We recently had an opposition of integrated information and global workspace at the meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness in New York last year. And there was a famous discussion of it, a bet, and it's created a great deal of fuss online. So these I'm separating out the biological ones because these are friendly to meat-free, and that's the X over the meat-free implementations. Let me explain. What is the global workspace theory? So this is a theory first advanced by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux. And the idea of the theory, this is their diagram. This outer circle is the outer surfaces of the body. These disks and dots are processors, and the links, these are links between them. The thick links are activated links, and the thin links are unactivated links. And the idea of this is that you get stimulations to the sensory surfaces of the body. Some processors and links are activated. So we have 4 activated processors, but some of those form a neural coalition that is with feedback processes within the sensory areas. And some of those feedback processes are mobilized into the conscious workspace. They stimulate an overall neural coalition involving central, that is cognitive activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortexes. And the idea here is that competition leads to what they call ignition, in which you get an activated coalition involving large-scale activation of the brain. Now, this structure does not require any particular implementation. It can run on a standard computer or a meat computer, but it doesn't require meat. Now, it is worth noting that this in this system, feedback is just as important, if not more important, than feed forward in forming these neural coalitions and triggering ignition. And it is worth mentioning that this architecture is foreign to current AI, the large language models, that's LLMs. So they have been almost entirely feed forward, although some feedback is allowed in some versions, but there's no version now that allows for this competition leading to ignition. Still, the main point here is that broadcasting in the global workspace does not the higher order thought theory. That's the theory that what it is to be conscious of a perception of a red thing is for that perception to be accompanied by a state of thought to the effect that I am seeing a red thing or a tomato. And this has been famously first put forward by John Locke, then later David Armstrong and David Rosenthal. Another version of this is Hak-Wan Lau's version, in which we don't have a double representation. We have a pointer to the perception. And on his account, on his account, what makes seeing the tomato conscious is that the perception is accompanied by a kind of monitoring. And arguably the thought doesn't require meat, and the pointers don't require meat. So no meat required in this view, probably. The final meat neutral theory is the integrated information theory, famously put forward by Giulio Tononi, which says that a system is conscious if and only if it's appropriately complex. It's the number of possible states, but those states have to be integrated with regard to one another. Feed-forward systems have zero integrated information. The measure is phi. So current AI systems do not do well as far as integrated information goes, but the main point is that you can have a lot of integrated information without meat. So these are all theories on which no meat is required. The one approach that does require meat is the biological theory. And this was first put forward by Hobbes, Smart, Feigl, and famously in the 90s, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, although Koch is now an advocate of the integrated information theory. The model is these theoretical identities. Water is H2O, light is electromagnetic radiation of certain wavelengths. And the idea here is that some biological features are necessary features of one sufficient condition for consciousness. We have no trouble finding a sufficient condition. The whole brain is a sufficient condition. But the question is, what's a necessary part of a sufficient condition? This area MTV5 is perhaps a necessary part of a sufficient condition for the perception of motion. So the question then is, the point is that some have assumed that we can find a necessary part of our sufficient condition of consciousness. And if so, we may want to hypothesize that it is a necessary condition of all consciousness. That is a very interesting question. And of course, this depends on why it is a necessary part of our sufficient condition. So what I'm going to suggest is that there are some ideas on which a necessary part of our sufficient condition might be necessary to all consciousness, and then some ideas on which that's not true. And that is really the crucial issue about whether consciousness requires meat. So some biological theories dictate that only a meat machine can be conscious. And so one would be the theory that electrochemical processing is crucial. So in our processing, we have a presynaptic terminus of an axon, and then we have a dendrite nearby that receives neurotransmitters, chemicals. This thing releases chemicals, and then those chemicals are taken up, and there's a neural impulse that goes down the axon, and the whole thing starts over again in these dendrites. So the overall, this diagram here is neurotransmitters flow, that's chemical. Gates open, causing sodium to flow into the cell. Electrical signals flow down the axon, and neurotransmitters are released again. So it's chemical to electrical, back to chemical, then to electrical again. And that is the way that our brain works. So one wonders whether this is actually a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition of human consciousness, but is it a necessary condition of all consciousness? So importantly, the case is not that all known cases of consciousness have F, so F is a plausible candidate for a necessary condition. Being made of carbon, all known cases are made of carbon, and that would be a poor candidate for a necessary condition, because we know that mere composition need not be fundamental to how a process works. In particular, we might have an electrochemical process that's not based on carbon. Being alive is crucial to all known cases of consciousness, but that may not be fundamental. And there's certainly plenty of living things that are not plausible candidates. So you might say electrochemical processing is computational too, but I think it's important to see that that may not be right. It can be described computationally, but the computations themselves may not be the equivalent of electrochemical processing itself in grounding consciousness. So the idea here is that every strong candidate for a phenomenally conscious being has electrochemical processing in neurons that are fundamental. That's the key point. Fundamental to its mentality. Many non-conscious things lack electrochemical processing, and here's some pictures of them. But here is very important, some non-conscious things have electrochemical processing, like cnidarians, like hydras, or organoids. So electrochemical processing is not sufficient for consciousness, but it might still be necessary. How can we approach this issue? Well, I think we could get some insight from evolution. So we can think about the question of these creatures called ctenophores. The C is silent. And there is a question as whether they were the first complex animals, the first animals to have neurons. And here is the debate. We have a common ancestor of animals. One possibility is neurons were developed in these ctenophores. They're also called comb jellies. Another possibility is that the first animals were sponges. Sponges do not have neurons, and that comb jellies were are descended from some version of a sponge in prehistory, and that they were the first neurons. This one is called the ctenophore sister hypothesis. The idea is that ctenophores, like the kind we have today, the comb jellies, are not thought to be the ancient creatures, but some early version of them, their sister. It's the terminology used in evolutionary biology. Some sister of them might have been the source of animal neurons. That contrasts with the sponge sister hypothesis, in which the sponges were the first creatures, and that the ctenophores or comb jellies develop neurons after having been descended from sponges. If the ctenophore sister hypothesis is a puzzle, why would they lose them? So just to be clear about the difference here, this is a ctenophore or comb jelly, and this is sponges, and there's a disagreement about which came first. Importantly, creatures that have neurons also have muscles and a gut, whereas sponges have no neurons, no muscles, no gut. So this is the gut of a comb jelly. It has muscles that help to process food, and the neurons govern that. So how can we approach this issue? Well, there have been two major evolutionary discoveries in the last year on this issue. And this is what has prompted me to give this talk, actually, these two interesting discoveries. I've long been interested in this question, but these two interesting discoveries have been instrumental to thinking further about it. The first discovery, this is an article in Nature in 2023 about ancient gene linkages supporting the ctenophore as sister to other animals. So that supports the ctenophore first, the sister of the ctenophore first hypothesis. And this has been much reported in all the newspapers. And this, as I said, gives rise to the puzzle. If ctenophores were first, perhaps sponges lost neurons. But why? Well, the second discovery in the journal Science. So as you probably know, in the English-speaking world, Nature and Science are the two leading science journals. And it's pretty amazing that there were these two discoveries really that fit together extremely interestingly. So there is this paper in Science from 2023 about, I'm not sure how you pronounce this word, syncytial nerve net in a ctenophore adds insights on the evolution of the nervous system. So what is that? That is the idea that a ctenophore may have a purely electrical nervous system without electrochemical processing. And here is a news statement of this. Comb jellies, that's ctenophores, have a bizarre nervous system unlike any other animal. A 3D map reveals fused neurons that lack the space or synapses. Those synapses are where the chemicals are released. So just to reiterate, this is what we looked at before. You've got the axon terminal, you've got the dendrite receptor, and chemicals go into the cleft. Or there's another way that this can happen, which is the axon releases chemicals into the extracellular fluid. So neurons swim in a sea of fluid with neurotransmitters floating around. By contrast, there are electrical synapses. We have electrical synapses. They don't play a very large role. And this is the kind of synapse that it seems that ctenophores have, a purely electrical synapse. And now the question arises, which one was first, the chemical synapse or the electrical synapse? The evidence is now looking like the electrical synapse was first. And here is a diagram of the ctenophore electrical system. It's a complex web of purely electrical connections. I should say, by the way, that they only examined one stage in the life cycle of a ctenophore. So it is possible that there are electrochemical processes in some other stage. It's very difficult to study ctenophores, as it turns out, and I'm sure people will be working hard on this, but so far no results. So it looks like the ctenophore first, or the ctenophore sister first hypothesis is confirmed. And that leads to the question, or the point, that nearly the purely chemical form of bodily control we see in one-celled animals, nor the purely electrical form led to complex organisms, suggesting that there was something wonderful about the electrochemical form of control. But what was that wonderful thing? So here are three possibilities. One is that what was wonderful was some elementary form of consciousness. Another one, that it was crucial to learning. Another one, that it was crucial to inhibition. So I will examine these one by one. If it's some elementary form of consciousness, then electrochemical processing, in addition to being essential to our consciousness, might be essential to consciousness altogether. It might be that by purely electrical systems, you don't get consciousness from purely electrical systems, and that would show a major challenge to the consciousness of an AI system. What about learning? Well, we can get some evidence about learning by looking at the next step up the phylogenetic scale. This is Cnidaria, I think it's pronounced, and that includes jellyfish, coral, anemones, hydra, Portuguese man of war. And the point I want to make is that it looks like the learning in the in this family of organisms is not great. So this is a recent paper where he found abundant evidence of non-associative learning, habituation, and sensitization. Habituation is when the animal keeps getting the same stimulus over and over again, but the neural response is decreased. And sensitization, that looks like it. That's the main thing in sea anemones is they've evolved so that if you the form of sensitization that's been found is that if you vibrate something near them in a way that is compatible with what a fish would do, they eat by stinging fish. So if you vibrate something near them, then their touch sensors are more active in order to determine whether the thing that's vibrating is food. So that's the kind of sensitization that they have. But there's very poor evidence of associative learning, like Pavlovian conditioning. I don't really understand this, and the article doesn't help with this. Sea anemones are a kind of Cnidaria, but he says, okay, so this, all right, so this is not contradictory, but the paper itself is a bit contradictory. This says that he could only find one paper that suggested Pavlovian conditioning and no studies supporting operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a really important kind of learning. So the evidence for learning of any substantial kind in these organisms, the next step up, is weak, suggesting maybe learning wasn't the main thing for electrochemical processing. What about inhibition? Well, inhibition is, arguably simple electrical circuits activate but do not inhibit. And inhibition is important to attention and indirectly to consciousness. But on this option, electrochemical processing is just one way of doing something that can be done electronically. So to sum up here, if what was wonderful about electrochemical processing is some early form of consciousness, that's a meat-friendly idea. But for learning and inhibition, those cases maybe meat is necessary for human consciousness, but not for consciousness per se. And I'm not taking a stand on which of these is right. I'm just trying to present the issues. So what we see here is that we have some insight from looking at evolution. We have some reason to believe that electrochemical processing is really important to the way our brains work, but it might only apply to us and not to AI. So of people who take meat seriously, really the only ones who've published on this that I know of are me and Peter Godfrey Smith. So he has an alternative view. What is his alternative view? He thinks about the evolution of electrochemical signaling as due to the fact that chemical signaling is too slow and insufficiently deterministic. And he criticizes my views on this, saying the property Block emphasizes, that's electrochemical signaling, might be a near inevitable way of doing things once you get beyond very simple nervous systems. As, I don't know how you pronounce this guy's name, Gaspar Jekili has discussed, a chemical brain that uses the broadcast of many signaling chemicals and lacks targeted projections between neurons could work well in some ways, but perhaps only in simpler nervous systems and where speed does not matter much. And he goes on to say that if an electrochemical back and forth is near inevitable, that is not a problem for Block. This feature has to have an evolutionary story of some kind behind it. But what I don't yet see in this proposal is why the back and forth is a gap bridging sort of property in the sense of Levine's explanatory gap, how it links to the physical explanation of experience itself rather than just being something in brains that makes general sense from a design point of view. Some of this gap bridging is what I try to show from my view above in that discussion of a link between the perturbation of global states of activity and the multifaceted nature of experiential profiles. So what is he talking about when he speaks of the explanatory gap? This is the question of why the neural basis of this experience is the neural basis of that particular experience as opposed to some other experience or none at all. And it is also known under the heading of the hard problem of consciousness, in the words of my colleague Dave Chalmers, who distinguishes between easy problems of consciousness, which have to do with the function of consciousness, the information processing function, as opposed to the hard problem, which is why is the neural base of this experience the neural base of that experience at all? So Peter Godfrey Smith, I'm abbreviating his name as PGS, he thinks that global states of activities help to solve the hard problem. Why does he think that? Well, here's what he says. When neural activity has the form of large-scale dynamic patterns that are modulated, a range of different senses and other factors will naturally tend to affect the present state. An internal state strongly affected by what the animal is seeing will also be affected by tactile sensing, proprioception, and more. The gestalt-like character of experiential profiles, with the ebb and flow of salient modalities and attention, also the role of mood and energy level and so on, is naturally explained on this view of nervous system activity. A particular combination of nervous system features has something of a bridging role with respect to the explanation of consciousness. In other words, these large-scale dynamic patterns are supposed to explain the unity of experience. And then he goes on to say, all of it suggests an experience-relevant role for large-scale dynamic patterns. Nervous system activity combines point-to-point network interactions with more diffuse, somewhat holistic electrical phenomena. This combination, I conjecture, is pivotal to the biology of felt experience. So this is all in a paper that he sending around to some people. You might be able to get it from him. It's not yet published. It was more or less a transcript of a talk he gave here. That talk may have been recorded, I don't know. But if you are interested in reading the paper, you could write to him. I have it, but I couldn't send it around without his permission. But anyway, it's a really great, interesting paper. However, I am very skeptical about these large-scale dynamic patterns. I'm skeptical both that they are central to conscious experience, and more significantly, I'm very skeptical that they have to bridge the explanatory gap. On the question of whether they really have a lot to do with sensory experience, consider the question of DC current versus AC current, direct current versus alternating current. I'm sure, as most of you know, around in the late 19th century in New York, there was a battle between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Edison favored direct current and Tesla favored alternating current. Tesla won out, although there is still some direct current. I actually had an elevator once that functioned on direct current in Boston. And that alternating current alternates in different countries at different rates. I don't know what it is in Iran, but I'm going to see if I can find it. Let's see. Okay, as far as I can find, Iran, like the US, has 60 hertz current, but a lot of UK and a lot of Europe has 50 hertz. That means 50 cycles per second. So as I understand it, in Iran and in the US, the electricity is reversing polarity 60 times a second. Now, here's what's interesting about that, is that it causes some flicker in lights. So incandescent lights, there's not that much flicker. Fluorescent lights, much more. And the many LED lights, there's up to 100% flicker. It's flickering at a rate too high to see, but it affects your brain. Now, some LEDs now convert to direct current. So maybe Edison was right after all. So I'll just mention two studies on this. This is a study from 2020 on a flickering red light stimulus for promoting 40 hertz neural oscillation. And there are two interesting results here. One is they showed that the 40 hertz light did make a big difference in 40 hertz oscillation in the visual cortex, but also some spreading to some extent into the frontal lobe. So it looks like it affects the whole brain, at least to some extent. But its impact on the mind was really almost nothing. They did find some reduced sleepiness, but not a lot. And, you know, if this is really enormously important to our mental life, you'd expect something better than a slight decrease in sleepiness. Note that he says that it's pivotal to the biology of felt experience. If it's pivotal, then there should be large effects. In the early days discussion of consciousness, there was a lot of talk about cortical oscillation. And Crick and Koch hypothesized that 40 hertz oscillation was crucial to consciousness. And there was some work then done. And Anthony Movshin, who's my colleague here at NYU, did some work on this. And what they did was they looked at stimulus flicker. And they noted that many cells respond to light flicker at frequencies in the oscillation range in the brain, and that the firing elicited by flicker is similar to the oscillatory activity of cortical neurons, which is said to underlie perceptual grouping phenomena. But what they found was performance was neither helped nor hindered by the temporal pattern of flicker. These results suggest that physiologically observed oscillatory responses are unrelated to the processes underlying visual segmentation and perceptual grouping. And it's just another point that these oscillations really don't seem to, these large-scale oscillations do not seem to have an effect. So if these dynamic patterns are really pivotal to the biology of felt experience, why aren't there more notable effects? Now, I don't know whether I should. So here's a question. I have one more section, but I don't want to not have a question period. So maybe I should, what do you think? Maybe I should stop now.
Ned, if you want to end your, we have time for Q&A. We have if you want to finish, and then we'll have all of our Q&A after when you finish your presentation. But yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just do a quick version of this. Also, I have to go and have lunch before my class, so I teach in a little while.
Okay.
So I'll make the I'll make this relatively quick. Okay, so it's kind of unrelated to the rest of the talk. I think I won't do it. Okay, why don't we have the question period now?
Okay. Questions for. Thank you for your presentation. I think we'll have time for your the 6-part presentation. Okay. محمد رضا میکروفونت وصل.
I'm not hearing anybody.
Yeah. میکروفونت وصله.
Hello, Ned. Do you have my voice?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm very thankful of you, Ned, because your interesting and insightful presentation. I have a question that what I understand from this presentation, that we have two major conditions for consciousness. One condition is a biological theory that you have electrochemical process that maybe is necessary for consciousness but not sufficient. And one condition is integrated information theory that say we should have sufficient level of complexity and integrated information for have consciousness. What I'm trying to ask is if we have these two major conditions for consciousness, that means in biological theory we have the sufficient level of complexity in biological structures of human brains, and the sufficient level of complexity of integrated informations in human brains. If we have these two major conditions in artificial intelligence systems, can we say that these systems have consciousness, or you think that there are some conditions that we have not explored yet?
Yeah, so there's a lot of controversy over both the biology centric view, like I favor, and the integrated information theory. And I think many people who work on this would say that neither of those are sufficient for consciousness. And so they point to two other factors. One factor is whether there is some kind of higher order monitoring. So that's the view held by Hak-Wan Lau, Axel Clearman, Steve Fleming, Matthias Michel. Quite a few researchers in this area are convinced that higher order monitoring is required and maybe is both necessary and sufficient. And that maybe the integrated information approach is all wrong. The integrated information approach has some very bizarre consequences, as Scott Aronson has shown. And one of those bizarre consequences is you can take a simple error correcting circuit and multiply it repeatedly, and you get a system that is way more conscious than we are. So he showed this, that a replicated error correcting circuit, you could, if you have enough of them, you get a very highly conscious system. And also, as many people have emphasized, very simple systems have some element of consciousness according to integrated information. Really anything that has just a small number of states that are somewhat integrated with each other has some element of consciousness. So those are all very surprising. The other point of view, consciousness without ignition and global broadcasting. So I think overall, most people are willing to consider alternative theories held by other people. They would agree that there are substantial, there are important theories that would disagree with what you're saying. Sorry, is that intelligible? Hello? Anybody there?
Yeah, Ned, I think he was satisfied. I'm going through the questions and seeing, let's see, okay, in the chat box. They actually, looks like they found a Geoffrey Smith's paper, I guess, or maybe another paper. It's maybe published, but okay, someone raised his or her hand. Mohammed Hussein, میکروفون رو دادم. Okay. Mohammed Hussein, yeah? آقای حیدری بنی. You can ask your question.
I see in the chat, Fateme Raudbari, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, says that some famous philosophers and scientists claim that IIT, Integrated Information Theory, is pseudoscience. Yes, that's what I was alluding to. The reason they say it's
Yeah.
pseudoscience, I don't agree with that myself, but I think what is true is it has some bizarre consequences and also is very hard to test because the measure of consciousness, this phi thing, is very hard to compute. Many people have said that you can't really have a good test of it. Now, of course, it is concrete enough so that Scott Aaronson was able to show that just by stringing error correcting circuits together, you would get something with very high phi. So it has some consequences. They're odd ones.
Yeah.
Another consequence that Aaronson showed that is even more surprising is that the string, that the grid of error correcting devices doesn't have to be active. That is, it can be entirely quiescent. What counts for the integrated information theory is what it would do if it was activated. So it doesn't actually have to be active.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very odd consequence too, given that the one thing we know about all creatures that have consciousness is that their neurons are very active. Somebody says that they don't have the slides.
No. In the beginning, I had this.
Couldn't hear that, but okay. So
Ned,
I see some other questions here.
Yeah, Ned, do you want to finish your presentation, or do you want to answer the questions?
What?
Do you want a presentation, or do you want to answer the questions?
Well, I'm fine with either one.
What do you say we finish the presentation, go back to the questions? What do you think about that?
What?
What do you think about you finish the presentation and then we go to the questions?
Oh, sure. Okay, I will do that. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's see. So, okay, window. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yeah. We were at fading qualia, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So this requires a distinction between standard functionalism that says that the mental nature of a state is constituted by its causal relations to inputs, outputs, and other mental states. And my colleague Dave Chalmers' functionalism, which says that the mental nature of a state is nomologically determined by its causal relations to inputs, outputs, and other mental states, where nomological determination is determination according to laws of nature. So what my colleague Dave Chalmers thinks is that in the actual world, the laws of nature are such that functionalism applies, but that there are possible worlds in which functionalism and physicalism generally fail. So it's a weaker view than standard functionalism, which says there are no possible worlds in which functionalism fails. So functionalism of either kind puts pressure on biological theories, since it opens the door to creatures that are functionally like us and arguably mentally like us, but lack the relevant biology. So if functionalism is true, as advocated by that paper I mentioned at the outset about large language models, then the biological theory is probably wrong. So the idea is that, so this is Commander Data, who you may know from Star Trek. So he is mentally like us, perhaps, but lacks our biology. So what is the argument? So we're talking about the fading qualia argument. What is that argument? So this is an argument by my colleague Dave Chalmers, and the argument is that if absent qualia are possible, fading qualia are possible. Fading qualia are not possible, so absent qualia are not possible. Absent qualia would be a creature that is functionally like us but doesn't have any consciousness. So he's saying if you duplicate the functional processing in the actual world, you will duplicate the consciousness. And he's talking about nomological possibility. Okay, so that's the basic line of, that's the argument. We're agreed that absent qualia are not nomologically possible. Dave Chalmers, we all agree, but for different appeals to human rationality, whereas Peter Godfrey Smith and I appeal to the biology of consciousness. So how does Chalmers' argument work? I suggest to everybody that you read it, or you can read a summary of it in my recent book, which is available for free on the Oxford University Press website, and also on my website. So the idea is we have a brain, which I'm symbolizing by 2 neurons. That's stage 1. Stage 1.1 is to replace 1 neuron by a magical microchip that not only duplicates the electrical activity of the cell, but also its chemical activity. And it does whatever is required to duplicate the neuron. And then you have 1.2. And then stage 2 is you've got silicon replacements of all cell bodies. And then the next stage is you replace everything else by silicon. And you have then a complete silicon replacement. So so you start with conscious Dave. This is Dave Chalmers' example. You end with a zombie robot that looks just like Dave and behaves just like Dave. And then the idea is that in between, you've got this series of replacements. So the argument is meant to be a reductio ad absurdum. There's something supposed to be impossible about this process, and that leads to the conclusion that the zombie robot is not possible. The idea is that this replacement in Joe, we call the intermediate stage Joe, preserves large-scale aspects of neural architecture without the electrochemical or quantum mechanical features of neurons. So now why is this supposed to be impossible? So what is supposed to happen in this period? Well, one possibility is that qualia suddenly disappear. At some stage, the replacement of a single neuron makes Joe a zombie. And as Chalmers, I think, correctly says, this would be an unprecedented brute discontinuity in laws of nature and counter to everything we know about neuroscience. We can eliminate this option. What about this? That Joe, there will be some stage at which Joe has a weak version of consciousness. Or another version is Joe sees something substantially different from bright red, something less complex. Or Joe loses one modality or loses color vision. But Joe says and judges that he sees bright red. So what Chalmers argues is that these are significantly implausible. And what's mostly implausible is that Joe would have a weak experience or lose a modality, but as far as what he says goes, be just the same as Dave, completely normal. And then there are other people who say it's actually incoherent. This is Ty and Shoemaker say that the description of Joe is incoherent or otherwise conceptually flaws. So what Chalmers says is that the description of Joe conflicts with what we know about nomological possibility. In particular, he says, for a sentient rational being that is suffering from no functional pathology to be so systematically out of touch with its experiences would imply a strong dissociation between consciousness and cognition. We have little reason to believe that consciousness is such an ill-behaved phenomenon and good reason to believe otherwise, unless we are prepared to accept this massive dissociation between consciousness and cognition. The original system must have been conscious after all. And so that's the idea that there is no zombie robot at the end of this process. So here is where I think this argument goes wrong. There are two senses. So the argument is based on the idea that for a sentient rational being that is suffering from no functional pathology cannot be so systematically out of touch. But the question is, what is that functional pathology? So what Chalmers is thinking about is what might be called orthodox functional pathology. Joe's reasoning, inference, and other rational processes, insofar as they affect his behavior, would be impaired. But he claims they're not impaired. He claims that as far as what Joe says and does, it makes rational sense. If he sees something that he is important to his values, he does the right thing. But there's another sense of functional pathology, which is introspective functional pathology. His introspection doesn't work properly. He's losing his sensation, his experience, but his beliefs are just the same as they would have been otherwise. So his beliefs about his own phenomenal states are systematically wrong. And that is a kind of introspective functional pathology. So Chalmers, Ty, and others pick this interpretation, but what about this interpretation? So my argument is that if consciousness really does have an electrochemical nature, the thought experiment is set up so as to create a bizarre relation between that electrochemical nature and cognition. So that very bizarreness cannot be used as an argument against the electrochemical nature of consciousness. And that's the end of the talk.
That's all, folks. Thank you, Ned, so much. Thank you. Really, you went, first of all, it was so multidisciplinary and at the same time, and it was like the most recent studies and the philosophical arguments.
Well, the interdisciplinary philosophy of mind is really important. The number of interesting results in neuroscience, biology, and artificial intelligence that are interesting to philosophers is just astonishing. And they cry out for philosophers to be thinking about them.
Yeah.
And it's really important for philosophers to get involved in some of this empirical material. It's really the most popular area of philosophy of mind right now, and really important to understanding not just the mental nature of machines and neural complexes, but also their political and ethical properties. And philosophers really need to get involved in this.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. I personally enjoyed a lot, learned a lot, and I'm going to go through the questions as fast as I can. So Mohammed has asked, what steps do you think we should take to get closer to the final answer? For example, in neuroscience.
Well, I think that people are pursuing neuroscientific theories of neuroscience, the way that neuroscience impinges on all four of those theories. There's a hugely active community of researchers, including a lot of philosophers, and centered around. So, for example, at University College London and the Wellcome Center, there's a group of neuroscientists and also philosophers involved in thinking about the higher order or monitoring approach, centered around Steve Fleming, Nadine Dijkstra, and some other people, and a lot of activity there. There's a weekly consciousness club meeting that some of your listeners may be interested in. Anybody can join, and I would say they have some of the best people showing up at that thing. There's a lot of interest in London, and there's a large group centered around Hak-Wan Lau on higher order thought, with a lot of really interesting stuff going on. There's a lot of really interesting material available that neuroscientists, philosophers are all working on. So I think that there will be many interesting developments in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Next question is from Mohammed Hussein. Hi, Ned. Thank you for your presentation. I want to know if you think that AI cannot be conscious as it needs electrochemical structures.
Well, okay. So my answer to that was in this slide. Let's see. I'll get it up. Let's see if I can. Okay, this slide. Yeah, my answer to that is this slide. I think the evolutionary argument that I gave depends on what electrochemical processing is for. One possibility is it's for some elementary form of consciousness. The other two possibilities are learning and inhibition. If either of these is true, then meat, although necessary for human consciousness, might not be necessary for machine consciousness. If this is true, meat might be necessary, that is, electrochemical processing might be necessary for machine consciousness too. So, my official view is I'm trying not to take a stand on this. I think there are various possibilities. These evolutionary results only came out in the last year. So there's discoveries all the time that are relevant. And I think philosophers really need to keep their eye on scientific developments to see what they suggest.
Yeah. The next question, it's Fatima's, his continuation of the pseudoscience of IAT. So she responded that, so we claim other theories of conscience are pseudoscience because they're also hard to test. And I would like to ask you that, what is your view of the letter that was signed that IAT was a pseudoscience, and it had a lot of there was a lot of controversy around it. A lot of famous people, Daniel Dennett signed, I think, signed that kind of letter. So I want to know what's your view on that letter.
Okay, so those are two different questions.
Yeah.
So the question that Fatima actually asked was not, what do we think about the letter? What do I think about the letter?
Yeah. I just added that. The second question was my question, kind of. I kind of cheated.
Okay, but I'm going to answer her question first.
Yeah.
So her question is, are other theories of consciousness pseudoscience and hard to test? No, they're not. So Dave Chalmers and I, together with BU Jade He, are running a Templeton World Charities adversarial collaboration with some other researchers, and who are Megan Peters, Rachel Dennison, and Jan Broskamp. And we are testing higher order versus biological theories. And we've done a number of experiments. There will be some papers coming out, and it is not that hard to do tests. Basically, what you want to find is whether there are, so the higher order states and pointers are in prefrontal cortex. So what you want to try to find is whether there's some prefrontal component to to conscious states. So you can look at that prefrontal component. It's much harder to find a prefrontal pointer component than to look for decoding in prefrontal cortex. So, but that's relevant. That is relevant to testing the higher order view. Also, well, I'll stop at that. So no, I don't think these are hard to test. Global workspace is also not hard to test, and tests are going on right now. And we had some results last June that were released, and they show some successes for the global workspace theory, but some challenges. So I think these are genuine. These views are not impossible to test. In fact, we're testing them now. Okay, so moving to the letter. As many people pointed out, the tests of integrated information theory in the first phase of this adversarial collaboration really didn't test anything important to integrated information. They tested auxiliary. Information theory is very pseudoscience. I do not think it is a pseudoscience, so I disagree. I did not sign that letter. I think it is hard to test, but that there are identifiable consequences, like the identifiable consequence that Scott Aronson pointed out, that a large collection of error-correcting circuits would be more conscious than we are. That is a real consequence. It's a very implausible consequence. And so I would say it's not a pseudoscience for that reason, although I think there's a lot of truth in the pseudoscience claim. And I would add further that a lot of the popularity of the integrated information theory has to do with the fact that Christoph Koch, who is a leading person in consciousness studies, is an advocate of it. And I think these personal factors do come in. So I did not sign that. I would not sign it. But I think there's some truth in it, but I do not think that integrated information theory is a pseudoscience.
Okay, thank you. We still have questions.
I think just one more. I think one more question because I have to go to lunch before my class.
We have two. So we have two.
Okay.
And آقای فروردین میکروفونتون وصله. آقای فروردین. آقای همزاده. استاد همزاده میکروفون شما رو وصل کردم. شما هم سوال دستتون رو بلند کردید.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we have your voice.
Thank you. As you know, recent research shown that the genetic molecule.
I'm afraid I can't. I can't hear the question.
Oh, okay. I will type it in chat box. So thank you.
Oh, okay. صداتون قطع
Maybe I should just read the chat question.
The chat, I asked pretty much the chat questions. Maybe. Oh, okay. I'll read it for you. Oh, okay. Oh, we got right now 2 recent ones. Thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering how would you respond to criticism of the concept involving Davidson hypothetical being swamp man who appears out of nowhere due to rare event in a swamp without any ancestors, yet is similar to us in every other way.
Yeah, I think the swamp man is conscious because it has all the brain processing of a conscious being. You know, this raises the question of so-called externalism about the mind and about consciousness. I think that the fact that the swamp man has no evolutionary history is relevant to the intentional contents of the swamp man. And those who think, like Michael Tai, for example, that consciousness requires those intentional contents, they think the swamp man is not conscious, and that shows that the biological theory is wrong. But I don't hold that. I think the swamp man is conscious.
Okay. Next question. As you know, he typed it down. As you know, some recent researchers have shown that the genetic and molecular structure of some parts of the brain, such as cerebellum, is relevant in creating some conscious state. It's published in Nature journal last November. Assuming DNA is involved, what do you think is the path to a kind of biological AI?
Okay, so I don't know about these results, so I can't really comment on them. I'm sorry. There have been plenty of results that the cerebellum is not very involved in consciousness, so I would be a bit skeptical, but I'd like to read about that.
Yeah. And
okay, so I see there's another one here.
Yeah, we'll put this at the last one. I know you have a class and you have to take lunch, so we'll put this at the last one. Thank you for a great presentation. This is Firuz asking this one. Thank you for a great presentation. I think I missed something in your presentation. You mentioned in the flicker that the oscillations does not affect the performance. Then it's not pivotal to the biology of felt experience. In this task, if this task is right, what about the other oscillations which perturbing them can affect the felt experience and performance? I think I missed something.
I'm sorry. Yes, it's me. I'm the one who didn't properly state what I was trying to say. So, of course, oscillations are very important. Brain, circuits that hum together, work together. The brain circuits communicate via oscillations. Yes, oscillations are extremely important in the brain. So I agree with that, and if you interrupt them, you can create problems. However, the results I presented were about what you might call large-scale oscillations that just make the whole brain resonate with oscillatory signals, and those don't seem to have much to do with it. So I was tailoring my remarks specifically to Godfrey Smith. About the large scale. He thinks there are these large scale oscillations that are fundamental to the unity of consciousness. And I was just giving a single data point in opposition, which is that we can have these large scale operations due to lighting, flickering lights that really don't seem to have much consequence for mentality at all. So, but I wasn't meaning to argue that oscillatory behavior isn't important. There are all kinds of oscillatory things in the brain that are fundamental to the way the brain works. So I'm sorry, that was my fault.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any time left?
Is there one more?
I think we don't have any more questions. Actually, I wanted to ask a question, but
okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So, you mentioned it, but I wanted like more exact. Right now you talk about necessity of electrochemical from evolution type, but what about just the carbon cell, just carbon structures? Can the carbon can we replace it with a silicon as the robot zombie that we had in Chalmers' argument? Can we replicate that electrochemical signaling with silicon structures, or is the carbon structure a necessity too?
Okay, I would like to know the answer to that question, and if you find out what it is, please let me know. Yeah, I do not know the answer to that. I'd be very interested to find out. So if you find anything relevant on that, please tell me. I want to thank you all
Okay.
for listening.